September 1935. A doorman at Harlem's most famous nightclub made a mistake. He called the wrong man boy and told him to leave. The man smiled, walked away quietly, and 3 weeks later, the most powerful whites-only establishment in New York was forced to its knees. This is how one insult changed an entire city. Harlem, New York. September 19, 1935. Thursday evening, a few minutes past 8 o'clock. The streets gleamed wet from an earlier rain, reflecting the glow of streetlights and the neon signs that marked the establishments lining West 142nd Street. The air carried the sound of distant jazz, laughter spilling from doorways, the hum of automobiles navigating the narrow roads. Harlem at night was alive with energy, a neighborhood that had become the cultural heart of Black America, a place where artists and musicians created works that would define an era, where families built lives despite the crushing weight of the Great Depression, where opportunity and oppression existed side by side in a tension that shaped every interaction, every transaction, every dream. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson walked toward the entrance of the Cotton Club wearing a navy blue suit that had cost him 3 months of earnings from his policy operations. The suit was tailored perfectly, hugging his shoulders, tapering at the waist, the fabric expensive enough that it caught the light differently than cheaper materials. His shirt was crisp white with French cuffs, fastened with silver cufflinks. His shoes were polished until they reflected the streetlights like mirrors. He was dressed as well as any white businessman who frequented Harlem's most famous nightclub, dressed with the kind of careful attention to presentation that came from understanding that appearance mattered, that respect had to be demanded through every detail before it could be earned through action. The man they called Bumpy had built an empire in the shadows. He controlled policy operations that generated thousands of dollars weekly, managed networks of runners and collectors, commanded loyalty from men who understood that Johnson's quiet voice and patient demeanor concealed a capacity for violence that emerged only when absolutely necessary but emerged with devastating precision when it did. He had survived conflicts with Dutch Schultz, had navigated the treacherous politics of Harlem's underworld, had earned a reputation as someone who kept his word, paid his debts, and never forgot an insult or a favor. But tonight, Johnson was not coming to the Cotton Club as a criminal. He was coming as a businessman, invited by Jacob Weinstein, a Jewish entrepreneur who operated several legitimate enterprises in Harlem and who had suggested they meet to discuss a business arrangement requiring privacy and discretion. Weinstein had proposed the Cotton Club as a meeting place, apparently believing that an exception could be made to the establishment's notorious whites, only admission policy for someone as important as Bumpy Johnson. The Cotton Club represented everything complicated about Harlem's relationship with white America. The establishment had opened in 1923, occupying a building on West 142nd Street in the heart of a predominantly black neighborhood. It had built its reputation on featuring the finest black musicians in America. Duke Ellington had made his name performing on that stage. Cab Calloway had packed the house night after night. The greatest jazz and blues artists of the era had played there. The club's decor evoked a plantation fantasy, with murals depicting southern scenes, palm trees, cotton fields, a romanticized vision of the Old South that white patrons from downtown Manhattan found exotic and thrilling. But despite being physically located in Harlem, despite depending entirely on black musicians, black waiters, black cooks, black cleaning staff, despite profiting from black culture and black talent, the Cotton Club maintained an absolute policy. Black patrons were not permitted in the audience. Black people could perform, could serve, could clean, could make the establishment function, but they could not sit at the tables, could not order drinks, could not enjoy the entertainment that their own community created. White people came to Harlem to experience black culture while ensuring that black people remained in subordinate positions, servants and performers but never equals sharing the same space. Johnson approached the entrance where a doorman named Thomas Murphy stood checking faces, making instant judgments about who belonged and who did not. Murphy was a large man, built solid, with the kind of physical presence that suggested he had handled trouble before and expected to handle it again. He wore the Cotton Club's uniform, well tailored, marking him as a representative of an establishment that prided itself on class and exclusivity. His job was simple: keep out anyone who did not belong. Murphy stepped directly into Johnson's path as he reached the door, blocking it with his body. His expression carried absolute certainty, the confidence of a man who knew that social conventions and institutional power backed whatever decision he made. "Where do you think you're going, boy?" The word hung in the air between them. Boy. Not sir. Not mister. Boy, the term white people use to diminish adult black men, to reduce them to something less than full human beings, to remind them that no matter what they accomplished or how they dressed, they remained subordinate in a social order that placed white people above them by default. Murphy's voice carried across the sidewalk to the line of white patrons waiting behind Johnson. "This club is for white patrons only. We don't serve coloreds here, except as entertainers and staff. You need to get back to Harlem where you belong, and stop trying to go places you're not wanted. Now move along before I call the police and have you arrested for loitering." The irony was almost absurd. Get back to Harlem. Murphy was telling Johnson to leave Harlem and return to Harlem, apparently unaware that the Cotton Club itself stood in the heart of the neighborhood, that the doorman at a Harlem establishment was ordering a Harlem resident to leave as if the white-owned business somehow existed outside the community that surrounded it. Johnson stopped walking. He looked at Murphy's face, studied the certainty there, saw the absolute conviction that a doorman at the Cotton Club had the authority and social backing to turn away any colored person regardless of who they were or what they had accomplished. Murphy probably did not know who Johnson was, did not recognize one of the most powerful criminals in Harlem standing before him. The insult was not personal. It was racial, institutional. The fundamental assumption built into establishments like the Cotton Club that white people could come to Harlem to be entertained by black musicians and served by black staff while simultaneously excluding black patrons from the audience. Behind Johnson, the line of white patrons watched. Some looked amused. Some appeared mildly uncomfortable. Some nodded with approval. They waited to see whether this well-dressed colored man would make trouble or would accept his dismissal quietly, the way colored people were supposed to accept being told they did not belong in white spaces. Johnson could feel their eyes on his back, could hear murmured comments about uppity coloreds and knowing their place. He understood that arguing with Murphy would accomplish nothing except giving these white patrons entertainment at his expense. It would result in police being called, Johnson being arrested or beaten or both, becoming a story they would tell their friends about the colored man who tried to force his way into the Cotton Club and had been properly dealt with by the authorities. So Johnson did something that required more self-control than most men possessed. He smiled. Not a genuine smile, but the kind of cold, measured expression that suggested he was memorizing Murphy's face and this moment, that he would remember both long after Murphy had forgotten this interaction. Johnson held Murphy's gaze for 3 seconds, long enough that Murphy's expression shifted from confident contempt to slight uncertainty as he recognized something in Johnson's eyes that suggested this had not ended the way Murphy thought it had ended. Then Johnson nodded once, a gesture that could have meant acceptance or could have meant something else entirely. He turned away from the Cotton Club entrance and walked back down West 142nd Street toward Lenox Avenue, his posture erect, his pace unhurried, giving no indication to anyone watching that he had just been publicly humiliated and dismissed like he was nothing. But inside, beneath the carefully controlled exterior, Johnson's mind was working. He walked for 15 minutes through Harlem's evening streets without any particular destination, just walking to give himself time to think, to let his anger settle enough that he could think strategically rather than emotionally. Violence would have been easy. Johnson had men who could have returned to the Cotton Club that very night, could have dealt with Murphy, could have sent a message that would have satisfied the immediate need for revenge. But violence would have solved nothing. It would have brought police attention, would have made Johnson look like a common thug, would have confirmed every racist assumption about colored criminality that white people use to justify discrimination. Johnson found himself standing outside the Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue between 140th and 141st Streets. He watched colored patrons entering, working people, professionals, families, entering an establishment that welcomed them, that was owned and operated by black businessmen, that provided entertainment and social opportunities without the humiliation that came from trying to enter white establishments that treated black people as servants or criminals or both. Standing there, watching people enter the Savoy, Johnson had a realization that would change not just his own thinking, but eventually would change the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry in ways that would echo for decades. The Cotton Club was in Harlem, on a Harlem street, employing Harlem musicians and Harlem staff, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars annually from white people who came to Harlem specifically to visit it. But despite being physically located in Harlem and despite depending entirely on black talent and black labor, the Cotton Club was owned by white businessmen, operated according to white rules, excluded the black community from participating as patrons. The establishment extracted wealth from Harlem, took the creativity of black musicians, the labor of black workers, the cultural cash of being located in Harlem, while giving almost nothing back to the community except minimum wage employment for the musicians and staff it could not avoid hiring. What Johnson realized was that this arrangement existed only because black Harlem lacked the economic power and organizational capacity to challenge it. The Cotton Club's owners assumed they could maintain their discriminatory policies indefinitely. What could black Harlem do about it? Black patrons could not force their way in. Black musicians needed employment too badly to boycott. Black workers could not afford to quit their jobs on principle when jobs were scarce during the Depression. The Cotton Club's owners had calculated correctly that individual black people lacked the power to challenge an established white-owned business with wealthy white patrons and political connections protecting it. But what the Cotton Club's owners had not calculated, what they could not have anticipated, was that someone with Johnson's resources and connections and willingness to use criminal methods for purposes beyond just making money might decide that being turned away from the Cotton Club's door was an insult that demanded a response not through violence, but through systematic economic warfare designed to make the Cotton Club's discriminatory policies so costly that the establishment either changed or failed. Johnson walked to a pay phone on the corner of Lenox Avenue and 141st Street. He made 3 phone calls that would set everything in motion. The first call was to Theodore Green, Johnson's attorney and closest advisor, a man who understood both legitimate business and the shadowy operations that funded it. The second call was to Stephanie St. Clair, the queen of policy, who controlled substantial gambling operations throughout Harlem and who had been Johnson's mentor before Johnson built his own independent organization. St. Clair was shrewd, ruthless, and commanded respect from every operator in Harlem. The third call was to Adam Clayton Powell Sr., minister of Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most influential legitimate leaders who had been fighting discrimination for decades but who had never had the kind of raw power necessary to actually force white establishments to change rather than just preaching about how discrimination was morally wrong. By midnight Thursday, Johnson had assembled 15 people in the back room of a speakeasy on 133rd Street. His own top associates sat alongside representatives from other black policy operators, union officials who controlled colored workers in service industries, ministers from major Harlem churches, and several black professionals including doctors and lawyers who had experienced their own humiliations at white establishments. Johnson stood at the head of the table and described what had happened at the Cotton Club, speaking in his characteristic quiet voice that made people lean forward to hear him. As he spoke, he watched faces around the table change from curiosity about why they had been summoned to anger about what Johnson was describing to something that looked like hunger, because they understood that if Bumpy Johnson was assembling this particular group of people, then he was planning something substantial, something that went beyond personal revenge. "The Cotton Club turned me away tonight," Johnson said, his voice carrying that particular controlled intensity that people who knew him recognized as more dangerous than shouting. "Because I'm colored. The doorman called me boy and told me to get back to Harlem where I belong." The irony, of course, is that the Cotton Club is in Harlem. It's on West 142nd Street, right in the middle of our neighborhood. It employs our musicians, our waiters, our cooks, our cleaning staff. It makes its money from being located in Harlem and from featuring black entertainment. But it won't let black people sit in the audience. It takes everything from us, our talent, our labor, our neighborhood's reputation, and gives us nothing back except minimum wages and the privilege of serving white people who come to Harlem to be entertained by our culture while making sure we understand we're not good enough to share their tables. Johnson paused, letting his words settle, watching the faces around the table. Several people nodded, recognizing their own experiences in what Johnson described, understanding that the Cotton Club's discrimination was not unique but representative of a broader pattern where white people profited from black culture while maintaining strict segregation that ensured black people remained subordinate. But here's what the Cotton Club's owners don't understand, Johnson continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear him. They don't understand that they're vulnerable in ways they haven't considered. The Cotton Club depends on black labor. Every musician, every waiter, every cook, every person who makes that establishment function is colored. The Cotton Club depends on being located in Harlem. Its entire appeal to white downtown patrons is that it offers an exotic experience of coming to a black neighborhood to see black entertainment. And the Cotton Club depends on Harlem tolerating its presence, depends on us not making trouble, not organizing resistance, not using the power we actually have to make operating a discriminatory establishment in our neighborhood so difficult and so expensive that it becomes unsustainable. Johnson stood now, began pacing behind the table, his intensity building. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to teach the Cotton Club's owners that extracting wealth from Harlem while insulting Harlem's people carries a cost. We're not going to burn the place down. That would just give them insurance money and sympathy. We're not going to attack their white patrons. That would give police justification to crack down on all of us. Instead, we're going to make operating the Cotton Club so difficult, so expensive, and so problematic that the owners conclude they have two choices. Either they open the Cotton Club to black patrons and end their discriminatory policies, or they sell the establishment to black owners who will operate it as an integrated venue. Either way, the current arrangement, white people profiting from black culture while excluding black people from participating as equals, ends. What followed was 2 hours of detailed planning as Johnson and the others developed a strategy that combined labor organizing, economic pressure, community mobilization, and the kind of subtle intimidation that criminals understood how to apply without triggering police response. The plan had multiple components that would be implemented simultaneously over the coming weeks. Labor organization would form the foundation. Every black employee of the Cotton Club would be contacted and asked to participate in coordinated action. Musicians would be asked to demand higher wages and better working conditions, threatening to strike if demands were not met. Duke Ellington, the Cotton Club's biggest draw, had already expressed private frustration with management's treatment of his band. With alternative offers in hand, Ellington could credibly threaten to leave. Waiters and kitchen staff would be organized to slow down service subtly, making the Cotton Club's operations less efficient without doing anything so obvious that they could be fired for sabotage. The goal was to increase the Cotton Club's labor costs and reduce its service quality enough that white patrons began complaining and operating profits declined. Supply disruptions would compound the pressure. The Cotton Club depended on various suppliers for food, liquor, linens, and other essentials. Through Johnson's connections and through St. Clair's connections, these suppliers would be contacted and given a choice. Stop doing business with the Cotton Club or face problems with their other Harlem customers. Since most suppliers did substantial business throughout Harlem, losing access to Harlem's broader market was more costly than losing the Cotton Club's business alone. The suppliers who agreed to stop servicing the Cotton Club would force the establishment to find alternative suppliers at higher costs and with less reliability. Community pressure would make the discrimination explicit and public. Harlem's churches and community organizations would begin campaigns criticizing the Cotton Club's policies, making it a subject of sermons and community meetings, creating social pressure that made the Cotton Club's racism impossible to ignore. The goal was not necessarily to stop white patrons from visiting. White people would do what they wanted regardless of what Black Harlem thought, but to create enough public controversy that the Cotton Club's policies became indefensible and embarrassing, that maintaining them required white people to acknowledge they were supporting discrimination rather than pretending it did not exist. Political complications would emerge through connections with corrupt police and politicians. Minor legal and regulatory problems would be created for the Cotton Club. Health inspections would suddenly find violations requiring expensive fixes. Fire safety reviews would identify concerns needing addressing. Liquor license renewals would be delayed, creating uncertainty about whether the club could legally serve alcohol. None of these problems would shut down the Cotton Club, but collectively they would cost money and attention and would make operating the business more complicated. Economic competition would provide alternatives. Johnson and St. Clair would invest in establishing or supporting entertainment venues in Harlem that welcomed Black patrons, venues that could compete with the Cotton Club by offering similar quality entertainment in integrated settings. If Black musicians could earn comparable or better money performing at integrated venues, if Black workers could find employment at establishments that did not practice discrimination, then the Cotton Club would struggle to maintain the Black talent and labor it depended on. The strategy was sophisticated and comprehensive, combining methods that ranged from completely legitimate labor organizing to barely legal intimidation, leveraging every form of power that Black Harlem possessed to challenge an establishment that had assumed Black Harlem was powerless. Everyone in that room understood they were participating in something unprecedented, a moment when criminal resources and methods were being weaponized not for personal profit but for a social goal, when Bumpy Johnson's anger about being turned away from the Cotton Club was being channeled into systematic organizing that could actually change the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry. The campaign against the Cotton Club began the following Monday, September 23, 1935. Duke Ellington, who had made his reputation performing at the Cotton Club and who remained the establishment's biggest draw, announced to management that he was demanding a 50% increase in his band's compensation and improved working conditions, including better dressing rooms, meal provisions, and respect from management. When management refused, pointing out that Ellington had a contract that did not expire for another 6 months, Ellington responded that contracts could be broken and that he had received multiple offers from other venues that would pay him substantially more than the Cotton Club was paying. The threat was credible because Johnson and St. Clair had indeed contacted Ellington with offers to perform at alternative venues. Ellington, who had experienced his own humiliations from Cotton Club management over the years, was willing to leverage those offers to extract better terms or to leave entirely if better terms were not provided. Simultaneously, problems began appearing throughout the Cotton Club's operations. Kitchen staff started working more slowly, claiming they were being careful about food preparation but actually coordinating to reduce the number of meals they could prepare per hour, creating longer wait times for white patrons unaccustomed to waiting. Waiters began making small mistakes, delivering wrong orders, forgetting drinks, taking longer than necessary to bring checks. Not enough to justify firing anyone, but enough to create frustration among patrons who expected perfect service. Suppliers began experiencing problems delivering on schedule. Trucks broke down. Orders were misfilled. Deliveries that should have arrived Monday would not show up until Wednesday, forcing the Cotton Club to scramble for alternatives and to pay premium prices for rush deliveries. By the second week, the Cotton Club's management was struggling with problems they could not quite identify the source of but that were clearly costing money and affecting the customer experience. Duke Ellington was threatening to leave, which would devastate the club's ability to attract white patrons who came specifically to see him perform. Labor costs were increasing as they gave raises to key employees to prevent them from leaving. Supply costs were increasing as they paid premiums for reliable deliveries. And mysteriously, Various regulatory agencies were suddenly finding problems that required expensive fixes. The health department wanted improvements to the kitchen. The fire department wanted additional exits installed. The liquor license authority was asking questions about whether the club's ownership structure complied with various regulations. The Cotton Club's owner, Owney Madden, was a white gangster who had built his fortune on bootlegging and who had purchased the Cotton Club in 1923. Madden understood that someone was organizing this pressure, that these problems were not coincidental. He had connections to other white organized crime figures, had political influence, had resources that should have allowed him to identify and crush whoever was causing trouble. But when Madden reached out to his contacts asking for help identifying who was behind the Cotton Club's problems, he kept hearing the same name, Bumpy Johnson. And when Madden tried to use his mob connections to pressure Johnson into stopping whatever he was doing, Madden discovered that none of the white gangsters he knew were willing to intervene in a conflict between Madden and Johnson over what was essentially a racial issue in Harlem, an area where white gangsters had limited influence and where Johnson had built relationships that made him more powerful in Harlem than any outside figure could be. After 3 weeks of mounting problems and mounting costs, Madden received a message asking him to meet with Theodore Green, an attorney who represented various Harlem interests. Madden agreed, assuming this was an attempt to negotiate some kind of settlement. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October 1935, Madden sat in Green's office listening to an explanation of exactly what was happening and exactly what would be required to make the problem stop. "Mr. Madden," Green said, speaking with careful precision, "the operational difficulties you've been experiencing at the Cotton Club are the result of organized response to your establishment's policy of refusing to admit Negro patrons. The policy is offensive to Harlem's community, is particularly offensive given that your establishment is located in Harlem and depends entirely on black musicians and black staff, and is no longer acceptable to the people who make your business possible. The difficulties will continue and will intensify until you announce that the Cotton Club will open its doors to Negro patrons, that colored customers will be welcomed and served with the same courtesy provided to white customers, and that you will take concrete steps to demonstrate this change is genuine." Madden's face flushed with anger. "You're telling me that coloreds are sabotaging my business? That Bumpy Johnson is behind this? I can have that man killed tomorrow. I've got connections throughout this city. You think some Harlem policy operator can threaten me?" Green's expression did not change. "Mr. Madden, you're welcome to attempt retaliation against Mr. Johnson if you believe that's wise. But I should inform you that Mr. Johnson has anticipated that possibility and has taken precautions. If anything happens to Mr. Johnson, the campaign against your establishment will intensify rather than stopping, because Mr. Johnson has organized a coalition of people who will continue this pressure regardless of what happens to him personally. And more importantly, Mr. Madden, you should consider whether the Cotton Club is worth dying over, because if you attempt violence against Mr. Johnson will respond with violence against you, and you'll discover that you have less protection in Harlem than you believe you have." The threat was clear and backed by reality that Madden understood once his anger cooled enough to think strategically. He could probably have Johnson killed if he committed sufficient resources to it. But doing so would trigger gang warfare that would cost more than the Cotton Club was worth, would bring attention from law enforcement that Madden wanted to avoid, and would solve nothing because the coalition Johnson had organized would continue pressuring the Cotton Club even after Johnson was dead. Madden was facing the same calculation that had defeated Dutch Schultz earlier that year when Schultz had tried to maintain control of Harlem against Johnson's resistance. That fighting Johnson in Harlem cost more than any possible benefit from winning, that Johnson had resources and community support that made him effectively unbeatable in his own territory. "What exactly are you demanding?" Madden finally asked, his voice controlled again, recognizing this was a negotiation rather than a situation he could solve through violence. Green pulled out a document he had prepared, a proposed announcement that Madden would issue stating the Cotton Club would no longer refuse service based on race. The announcement did not require Madden to actively recruit black patrons or to make dramatic changes to how the club operated, just required him to publicly commit that colored customers who attempted to enter would be admitted and served rather than being turned away at the door. The announcement would be publicized through Harlem's newspapers and churches, would be verified by having prominent black community members attempt to enter the club and be admitted, and would end the campaign against the Cotton Club if Madden maintained the policy genuinely rather than just issuing false statements while continuing to discriminate in practice. Madden spent another hour negotiating specific language and specific commitments, trying to preserve as much of the Cotton Club's existing character as possible while accepting the fundamental requirement that racial discrimination at the door had to end. On October 15, 1935, Owney Madden issued a statement announcing that the Cotton Club would welcome patrons regardless of race, that the club's historical policy of admitting only white customers was being changed, that colored customers who wished to attend performances would be admitted and served with courtesy and professionalism. The announcement was met with skepticism from many in Harlem's community, who assumed this was merely a public relations gesture that would not translate into actual change. Promises were easy. Performance was what mattered. To verify the policy was genuine, Theodore Green organized a test on the evening of October 18, 1935. A group of well-dressed black professionals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, business people, arrived at the Cotton Club and attempted to enter for the evening's performance. The doorman, who had presumably been instructed about the policy change, admitted them without incident. They were seated in the audience, were served by waiters, were treated with the same professionalism provided to white patrons, and were able to enjoy Duke Ellington's performance from the audience rather than being excluded while their culture was performed for white people's entertainment. Among that first group of black patrons to enter the Cotton Club was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, wearing the same navy blue suit he had worn 3 weeks earlier when Thomas Murphy had called him boy and told him to get back to Harlem where he belonged. Johnson walked through the door that had been barred to him, past a different doorman who greeted him with courtesy, and took a seat at a table where he could watch Duke Ellington perform. He did not make a scene, did not draw attention to himself, simply sat and listened to the music, drank his drink, existed in a space that had previously defined itself by his exclusion. The integration of the Cotton Club sent shockwaves through Harlem. If the Cotton Club, the most famous whites-only establishment in Harlem, could be forced to integrate through organized economic pressure, then the model could be applied to other discriminatory establishments. The victory demonstrated something that many had doubted, that economic power, when organized systematically and applied strategically, could force changes that moral appeals and legal challenges could not produce. Over the following months, Johnson and his coalition applied similar pressure to other venues that practiced discrimination. Some establishments integrated immediately rather than fighting, understanding that resistance would be costly and ultimately futile. Others tried to resist but discovered they faced the same mounting problems and mounting costs that had forced Madden to surrender. One by one, barriers began to fall. Restaurants that had refused black patrons began seating them. Theaters that had relegated black customers to balcony sections began allowing integrated seating. Nightclubs that had operated whites-only policies quietly changed them rather than face the kind of comprehensive campaign that had broken the Cotton Club. The methods Johnson pioneered became a blueprint, combining labor organization, supply disruptions, community mobilization, and targeted economic pressure into comprehensive campaigns against discriminatory establishments created a model that would be studied and replicated by civil rights activists throughout the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s as they worked to dismantle segregation across America. The Montgomery bus boycott, the lunch counter sit-ins, the economic boycotts that forced businesses throughout the South to integrate, all of these drew on principles that Johnson had demonstrated in Harlem in 1935, that economic pressure could change behavior when moral arguments failed, that collective action could overcome individual powerlessness, that patience and organization could defeat institutional discrimination. But Johnson's victory came with complications that revealed the limits of what economic pressure alone could achieve. The Cotton Club integrated, but it did not thrive as an integrated establishment. Many white patrons, deprived of the exclusive segregation that had been part of the club's appeal, simply stopped coming. The fantasy of visiting a black neighborhood to see black entertainment while being served by black staff had depended partly on the assurance that black people would remain subordinate, that white patrons would never have to sit beside colored customers as equals. When that assurance disappeared, so did many of the white customers who had made the Cotton Club profitable. The Cotton Club struggled financially after integration. Attendance declined. Revenues fell. The establishment that had been Harlem's most famous nightclub became just another venue. No longer special, no longer exclusive, no longer able to charge premium prices for the exotic thrill of segregated entertainment. In 1936, less than a year after integrating, the Cotton Club relocated downtown to West 48th Street, leaving Harlem entirely, continuing to feature black musicians but now operating in a white neighborhood for primarily white audiences. The move was presented as expansion, but it was actually retreat, an acknowledgement that the Cotton Club's business model could not survive in an integrated Harlem. Some saw this as proof that Johnson's campaign had failed, that forcing integration had destroyed rather than reformed the establishment. But Johnson understood the outcome differently. The Cotton Club leaving Harlem was acceptable because the Cotton Club no longer extracting wealth from Harlem while insulting Harlem's people was the goal. Whether the establishment integrated or left, either outcome was victory. The point had never been to save the Cotton Club. The point had been to establish that white-owned businesses could not operate in Harlem on discriminatory terms, that black Harlem had power to enforce consequences, that the era of white establishments profiting from black culture while excluding black people as equals was ending. And in the Cotton Club's place, new venues emerged. The Savoy Ballroom expanded. Small clubs that welcomed all patrons grew. Black entrepreneurs, seeing opportunity in the space the Cotton Club had vacated, opened establishments that provided entertainment without discrimination, that kept wealth circulating within the community rather than extracting it. Harlem's entertainment industry did not collapse when the Cotton Club left. It evolved, became more integrated, became more controlled by the community that had created the culture white people had come to consume. Johnson himself never spoke publicly about the Cotton Club campaign. He remained in the shadows, continued operating his policy business, continued building his influence through quiet power rather than public recognition. But the story spread anyway, became legend in Harlem, was told and retold until it achieved mythic status. The story of how Bumpy Johnson was turned away from the Cotton Club's door, walked away quietly, then organized a campaign that broke the establishment's color barrier and changed Harlem's entertainment landscape. The story became a teaching tool, a demonstration that power was not always about violence or immediate retaliation but could be about patience and organization and applying pressure until institutions broke under the weight of their own contradictions. Years later, when civil rights activists organized boycotts and sit-ins throughout the South, some of them knew the story of the Cotton Club. Some of them had studied what Johnson accomplished, had learned from his methods, had adapted his strategies for their own campaigns. They understood, as Johnson had understood in 1935, that economic power could force change when moral arguments failed, that collective action could overcome individual powerlessness, that institutions defended by law and custom and violence could still be vulnerable to sustained strategic pressure. Thomas Murphy, the doorman who had called Bumpy Johnson boy and told him to get back to Harlem where he belonged, probably never knew that his insult triggered everything that followed. Probably continued working at various establishments after the Cotton Club integrated. Probably never understood that his casual racism had been the spark that ignited a systematic campaign to break down barriers that people like him maintained through casual contempt delivered at doorways throughout the city. He was a minor figure, a man doing his job as he understood it, enforcing rules he had not created but was expected to maintain. But his insult and Johnson's quiet walk away, followed by strategic organizing that changed Harlem's entertainment landscape, became the story that mattered, became the lesson that endured. The Cotton Club saga demonstrated something fundamental about power and resistance in America. Institutional discrimination, even when backed by law and custom and social convention, remained vulnerable to organized economic pressure. White establishments that depended on black labor and black talent and black neighborhoods were not as secure as they appeared. Communities that lacked formal political power could still exercise economic power, could still make discrimination costly enough that maintaining it became unsustainable. The methods required patience, required organization, required willingness to sustain pressure over time rather than seeking immediate satisfaction through violence. But the methods worked. Bumpy Johnson lived until 1968, surviving decades in Harlem's underworld, navigating conflicts and alliances, building and maintaining power in an environment where most men who achieved his level of influence ended up dead or imprisoned young. He witnessed the civil rights movement, saw the methods he had pioneered applied on a national scale, watched as economic boycotts and organized resistance forced changes throughout the South that once seemed impossible. Whether he took pride in his role as a pioneer of these methods, whether he saw connections between his campaign against the Cotton Club and the larger movements that followed, remains unknown. Johnson kept his thoughts private, maintained his distance from public recognition, remained a figure of shadow and legend rather than documented history. But his legacy lived in the methods he demonstrated and the principles he established. That economic power, when organized and applied strategically, could force institutions to change. That communities without formal political power could still exercise leverage through controlling labor and commerce. That patience and organization could achieve goals that violence could not. That walking away from an insult was not weakness if that walk was the first step in a campaign that would break the institution that delivered the insult. Where do you think you're going, boy? Get back to Harlem where you belong. Those were the words that sparked everything. And Bumpy Johnson's response, walking away quietly, organizing comprehensively, applying pressure systematically, changing Harlem permanently, proved that belonging was not something white doormen granted or denied, but was something people with sufficient intelligence and determination claimed for themselves and for their communities. The Cotton Club integrated in October 1935 because one man decided that being turned away from its door demanded a response that would matter beyond personal satisfaction. That decision to respond strategically rather than emotionally, to organize collectively rather than act individually, to pursue lasting change rather than immediate revenge established precedents and demonstrated methods that influenced how black Americans fought for their rights for generations to come. The doorman called him boy. Bumpy Johnson walked away. And Harlem never looked the same again.